My name is Elena Torres, and 3 years ago, I was fired from the biggest house I had ever worked in for a crime I never committed. If you've ever been blamed for something you didn't do, if you've ever had to swallow your pride and walk away without a fight because you had no other choice, this story is for you. I want you to picture a house so large it had its own name, not an address, a name, Ashworth Manor. Sitting on top of a hill overlooking the entire city, with iron gates that took a full minute to open and a driveway longer than the street I grew up on. I started working there when I was 26 years old. A single mother, 2 jobs already, barely sleeping 4 hours a night, and somehow still smiling every morning because I had a daughter at home who needed me to be strong. The manor belonged to the Ashworth family. Old money. The kind of family whose name was on hospital, wings, and university buildings. Mr. Ashworth himself was rarely home. Always traveling, always in meetings, always somewhere on the other side of the world, building whatever empire it was that kept that house running. I never once met him in the 2 years I worked there. The person who actually ran that house was his housekeeper, a woman named Diane. Sharp-eyed, always immaculately dressed, always watching. I want to be fair to her, even now, even after everything. She ran that house like a machine, and for a long time, I respected that. I cleaned. I organized. I learned which vase went on, which shelf, which silverware was for which occasion, which rooms were never, under any circumstances, to be entered without permission. There was one room in particular, Mr. Ashworth's private study, on the second floor, at the end of a long hallway lined with paintings that were worth more than every house on my street combined. I was never allowed inside, not once, in 2 years. Diane made that rule clear on my very first day. If you're new to this channel, welcome. And if you've ever worked a job where you felt invisible, where your hard work went unnoticed while someone else got the credit, comment "I understand" below, because by the end of this story, I think you'll understand exactly what I went through. It was a Tuesday afternoon, almost 2 years into my job, when everything changed. I remember it so clearly because it started like any other day. I was finishing the West Wing, dusting frames, straightening curtains, humming quietly to myself the way I always did when the house was empty, and I could almost pretend, just for a moment, that it was mine. Diane found me around 3 in the afternoon. Her face was pale. Her hands were shaking, which I had never once seen in 2 years of working under her. "Elena," she said, "Mr. Ashworth's study has been broken into." I remember my stomach dropping. Not because I was afraid for myself. I hadn't done anything, but because I understood immediately how serious this was. A missing item from that room wasn't just theft. It was a scandal waiting to happen. Diane led me upstairs, and I saw it for the first time, the study door standing open, which it never was. Inside, a small antique safe had been pried open, and sitting on the desk, completely untouched, was a black velvet box. I asked what was missing. Diane's voice was tight when she answered. "A ring. A family heirloom. It's been in the Ashworth family for 4 generations. It is, without exaggeration, worth more than this entire house." I didn't understand yet why she was telling me this while looking directly at me. Not until she said the next sentence. "You were the only staff member in this wing today, Elena." I felt the floor tilt beneath me. I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that I had never once entered that room, that I didn't even know where the safe was, that in 2 years I had never broken a single rule in that house. But Diane's face had already closed off, and within the hour, security footage from the hallway camera, which conveniently only captured the door, not the room itself, showed me walking past that hallway at 1:47 that afternoon, exactly during the window the safe was believed to have been opened. I want to be honest with you. I had walked past that hallway. I always did, on my way to the linen closet at the end of the corridor. It was part of my normal route. But to Diane and to the private investigator the family hired within hours, it was all the evidence they needed. I was let go that same evening. No police were called. The family didn't want the publicity, I was told. But I was given 20 minutes to collect my things and escorted off the property by two men I had never seen before. I stood outside those iron gates with a small bag of belongings, my daughter's photo tucked inside my jacket pocket, and I remember looking back at that enormous house one last time, feeling something I had never felt before in my life. Not sadness, not even anger, not yet. Just disbelief. Complete, hollow disbelief that 2 years of honest work could disappear in 20 minutes because someone needed a name to blame. If this story is resonating with you so far, I want to ask you to do something small but meaningful. Hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps more people find this story, and trust me, you're going to want to see how this ends. The weeks after that were some of the hardest of my life. No references. No explanation I could give to a new employer that didn't sound like an excuse. I took whatever work I could find. Cleaning offices at night, scrubbing floors before sunrise, anything that would let me keep a roof over my daughter's head. I told myself, over and over, that the truth didn't matter anymore, that some doors, once closed, stay closed forever. I had no idea, sitting in my small apartment that night 3 years ago, exhausted and humiliated, that I would one day walk back through those same iron gates. Not as a maid, not escorted by security, but as the woman everyone in that house would soon be required to call Madam CEO. If you want to know exactly how a fired maid ends up running the very company that destroyed her name, make sure you're subscribed and stay until the very end of this story, because what happened over the next 3 years will genuinely shock you. Drop a comment telling me if you've ever been wrongly blamed for something at work. Share this with someone who needs to hear that the truth always finds its way out. And let's get to the moment everything started to change. Because 2 weeks after I lost that job, I got a phone call that I never expected. And it came from someone I had never even met. 2 weeks after I lost my job at Ashworth Manor, I was sitting at my kitchen table sorting through unpaid bills when my phone rang. The number wasn't saved in my contacts, and normally I would have let it go to voicemail. But something made me pick up. Is this Elena Torres? The voice on the other end was calm, professional, a woman's voice I didn't recognize. Yes, who's calling? My name is Margaret Chen. I'm an attorney. I represent a private client who would like to speak with you regarding your recent employment at Ashworth Manor. My stomach tightened immediately. I assumed the worst, that they were coming after me legally, that losing my job wasn't punishment enough, that now there would be a lawsuit on top of the humiliation. I didn't take anything, I said, my voice shaking. I don't care who's calling. I already told them the truth. Miss Torres, Margaret interrupted gently. This isn't about the accusation. My client believes you. He'd like to meet with you in person, if you're willing. I sat in silence for a long moment, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles ached. Who is your client? There was a pause on her end. I think it would be better explained in person. Would tomorrow afternoon work for you? I can send a car. I almost said no. Every instinct in my body told me this was some kind of trap, or worse, some cruel joke at my expense. But I was desperate, exhausted, and some small part of me still needed someone, anyone, to believe I hadn't lied. I agreed. The next day, a black car pulled up outside my apartment building at exactly 2 o'clock. The driver was polite, quiet, and drove me across the city to an office building I had passed hundreds of times but never once entered. A glass tower downtown, easily 40 stories tall, with the name Ashworth Holdings etched in brushed steel letters above the entrance. My hands were shaking as I stepped out of the car. This wasn't just connected to the family. This was the heart of their empire. I was led to the top floor by a receptionist who barely looked at me twice, through a set of heavy wooden doors and into an office that overlooked the entire skyline. Sitting behind the desk wasn't Margaret Chen. It was an old man. He was thin, dressed simply despite the obvious wealth around him, with silver hair combed back neatly and sharp, tired eyes that studied me carefully as I walked in. "Miss Torres," he said, rising slowly from his chair. "Thank you for coming. My name is Walter Ashworth." I froze. Walter Ashworth was the family patriarch, the man who had built the entire company from nothing 40 years earlier. I had cleaned his grandson's house for 2 years and never once met him. I had no idea he was even still involved in the company's daily affairs. "I don't understand," I said. "Why am I here?" Walter gestured for me to sit, and once I did, he folded his hands on the desk and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe. Or guilt. "3 weeks ago," he began, "my grandson's housekeeper informed the family that a family heirloom had gone missing from his study and that you were responsible." My chest tightened at the memory. "I didn't take it. I never even went into that room." "I know," Walter said simply. "The room went quiet." I stared at him, waiting for him to explain, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "After you were let go," he continued, "I asked for the full security footage to be sent to me personally. Not the edited version the investigator used. The full, unedited footage from every camera in that wing." He slid a folder across the desk toward me. It took my team 11 days to piece together what actually happened that afternoon. But once we did, the truth was impossible to ignore. I opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were printed still images, grainy, time-stamped, showing a woman entering the study through a side door that wasn't covered by the hallway camera the investigator had relied on. A woman in a staff uniform, but not mine. Her face was turned away from the camera in most of the frames, but in one, just barely, I could see enough to know it wasn't me. "Who is this?" I asked. Walter's jaw tightened. "Diane Whitfield, my grandson's housekeeper of 12 years. I felt the floor tilt beneath me for the second time in 3 weeks, but this time for an entirely different reason. She'd been quietly selling small items from the estate for over a year." Walter continued. "Nothing large enough to be noticed immediately. A piece of jewelry here, an antique there, always replaced with convincing excuses. The ring was the largest and most valuable piece she ever attempted to take. When she realized the safe had been discovered open, she needed someone to blame immediately, before anyone looked too closely at her own history in that house. And I was convenient," I said quietly. "You were convenient," Walter agreed. "Young, without powerful connections, without the resources to fight back. She gambled that you would simply disappear quietly. And for 3 weeks, that gamble worked. I didn't know whether to feel relief or fury. Both rose in me at the same time, so overwhelming that I had to press my hands flat against my knees just to steady myself. Where is she now?" "Diane was terminated the moment we confirmed the footage," Walter said. "The ring was recovered from a private buyer she had already contacted. Legal action is being handled separately, and it is being handled thoroughly, I assure you." I sat back in my chair, exhaling for what felt like the first time in weeks. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "I don't know why you went through all this trouble, but thank you." Walter studied me for a long moment before speaking again, and what he said next was not what I expected at all. "Miss Torres, I didn't ask you here simply to clear your name. I asked you here because of something else I found in that footage, something that had nothing to do with the theft." I blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" He reached into a drawer and pulled out another folder, thinner than the first, and placed it gently on the desk between us. "In 11 days of reviewing footage from every corner of that house, my team noticed something remarkable about you specifically. Every room you cleaned, every task you completed, the way you organized things that no one had asked you to organize, the way staff twice your seniority came to you, quietly, for advice on how to handle difficult situations in that house. He tapped the folder once. Miss Torres, I did not build this company by only rewarding people with the right last names or the right connections. I built it by recognizing people who understood how to run something well, even when no one was watching, even when no one gave them credit for it. My throat tightened. I didn't fully understand yet what he was suggesting, but something in his tone made my pulse quicken. I'm not offering you your old job back, he said, sliding the folder toward me. I'm offering you something entirely different, but it will require patience, education, and more work than you have ever done in your life. He opened the folder himself, turning it so I could read the single word printed at the top of the first page: traineeship. And beneath it, in smaller print, the words that would quietly begin to change the next 3 years of my life completely: Executive Leadership Development Program, Ashworth Holdings. I stared at the folder for a long time before I found the words to respond. Mr. Ashworth, I cleaned houses for a living. I don't have a business degree. I barely finished community college before I had to drop out to support my daughter. I don't understand why you would offer something like this to someone like me. Walter leaned back in his chair, studying me with the same careful patience he'd shown since I walked into his office. Do you know how I built this company, Miss Torres? I shook my head. I started as a warehouse clerk. 19 years old, no education beyond high school, counting inventory in a building not unlike the ones my own company now owns across 3 continents. He paused. Everyone who works above a certain floor in this building forgets that most success stories don't start in boardrooms. They start in the places nobody bothers to look. He slid the folder another inch closer to me. This program is difficult. It is not a gift. Over the next several years, you would work harder than you have ever worked in your life. Night classes, mentorship rotations through every department in this company, examinations that most university graduates struggle to pass. Most candidates who enter this program do not finish it. Then why me? Because in 11 days of watching footage of you working, Walter said, I saw something I have spent 40 years trying to find in employees who had every advantage handed to them. I saw someone who cared about doing things correctly, even when there was absolutely nothing to gain from it. I looked down at the folder, my hands still trembling slightly. My daughter, I said quietly. I have a 6-year-old daughter. I can't disappear into night classes and rotations if it means not being there for her. The program includes a living stipend significantly higher than your previous salary, full childcare support, and flexible scheduling built around your responsibilities as a parent, Walter said. I did not design this program for people without obligations, Miss Torres. I designed it for people who have every reason to say no and choose to say yes anyway. I signed the papers that afternoon. The first 6 months were the hardest of my life. I spent my mornings in warehouse logistics, learning inventory systems more complex than anything I'd imagined, standing shoulder to shoulder with employees who had engineering degrees and made it clear, in small, quiet ways, that they didn't understand why a former housekeeper was suddenly shadowing their supervisor. My afternoons were spent in night classes: accounting, business law, organizational management, surrounded by students half my age who had the luxury of studying full-time while I fell asleep more nights than I could count with a textbook still open on my chest. My evenings belonged to my daughter, Sophia, and no amount of exhaustion ever changed that. I made a promise to myself the day I signed those papers that whatever else I sacrificed, her bedtime stories would never be one of them. There were moments I nearly quit. I remember one night, halfway through the first year, sitting in my car outside the training facility after failing an accounting exam for the second time, crying so hard I couldn't see the steering wheel clearly enough to drive home. My phone rang. It was Walter. I almost didn't answer, embarrassed that he might somehow know about the exam. but something told me to pick up. "Miss Torres," he said, his voice steady as always. "I heard about today. I'm sorry, Mr. Ashworth. I don't think I'm cut out for this. I don't know why you. Do you know what I did the first time I failed at something in this business?" He interrupted. I stayed silent. I went home and I studied the mistake until I understood every single reason it happened. Then I tried again the next morning. Failure was never the problem, Miss Torres. Quitting is the only failure that actually matters. I retook that exam 11 days later and passed it with the second highest score in my cohort. Over the following 2 years, I rotated through nearly every department the company had: logistics, human resources, finance, customer relations, even a 6-month stretch working directly under the head of operations for the entire Western region. I made mistakes. I made plenty of them. But I also began to notice something happening that I hadn't expected. People started listening to me, not because of my last name, which meant nothing in that building, and not because of any connection to Walter Ashworth, which I made sure to never mention or rely on. They listened because I understood, in a way many of my more educated colleagues didn't, what it actually felt like to be on the ground floor of an operation, to be the person cleaning up messes no one else wanted to deal with, to notice the small inefficiencies that made everyone else's job harder. By the end of the second year, I was managing a team of 40 people in logistics restructuring, a role that had been given to 3 different candidates before me, none of whom had lasted more than 4 months. I lasted, and the department's efficiency improved by numbers significant enough that it caught attention well above my pay grade. It was during my 3rd year in the program that I received a message asking me to meet Walter in his office again, the same office where this entire journey had started. I walked in expecting a routine check-in, the kind we'd had every few months throughout the program. Instead, Walter looked more serious than I had seen him in years. "Miss Torres, please sit." I sat, my heart already beginning to race, sensing that whatever this conversation was about, it wasn't routine. "My health has not been what it once was," he said plainly, without any dramatics, the same directness he'd always spoken with. "My doctors have been clear that I need to step back from daily operations, effective immediately." "I'm so sorry to hear that," I said, and I meant it. Over 3 years, Walter had become something closer to family than employer. The board has spent the last several months evaluating internal candidates for the CEO position, he continued. "I want to be transparent with you, Miss Torres, because I believe you deserve nothing less than complete honesty at every stage of this. There has been significant resistance to your name being on that list." My stomach dropped, though I wasn't entirely surprised. I had felt the quiet skepticism from certain board members throughout my rotations, the ones who never said anything outright, but whose expressions made their opinions clear enough. "I understand," I said quietly. "I never expected this to be easy." "It hasn't been," Walter said. "But 3 years ago, I made you a promise that this program would judge you on merit and merit alone. I intend to keep that promise, regardless of how uncomfortable it makes certain people in this building." He paused, folding his hands the exact way he had the very first day I sat across from him. "The board vote is in 2 weeks, Miss Torres, and there is something you should know before that vote takes place." I braced myself, uncertain what could possibly come next after everything I had already been through. "Diane Whitfield's legal case concluded last month," Walter said. "But that is not what concerns me most right now. What concerns me is that one of the board members pushing hardest against your candidacy is someone whose name you will recognize immediately." He said the name, and when I heard it, every ounce of progress I had made over the past 3 years suddenly felt like it was standing on the edge of collapsing all over again. "Nathaniel Ashworth," Walter said. I sat completely still, the name settling over me like a weight I hadn't expected to carry again. Nathaniel, the grandson whose house I had cleaned for 2 years, the man whose study had been broken into, whose family heirloom had gone missing, whose housekeeper had destroyed my reputation to protect her own secret. I had never once met him in person during those 2 years. He had always been traveling, always somewhere else, a name on a mailbox rather than a real person to me. "I didn't realize he sat on the board," I said quietly. "He's held a seat for 6 years," Walter said. "He rarely attends in-person meetings, but he has made his opposition to your candidacy very clear through written statements to the other board members. Does he know it's me? The same person who worked in his house?" Walter's expression tightened slightly. "I believe he does. I believe that is precisely why he's opposing you." I felt something twist in my chest, somewhere between old humiliation and a fresh kind of anger I hadn't allowed myself to feel in 3 years. I had spent so long focusing forward, building skills, proving myself through work rather than words, that I had almost forgotten the particular sting of being dismissed by someone who had never once looked me in the eye. "What exactly is he saying?" I asked. Walter hesitated before answering. "His argument, in writing, is that promoting a former household employee to CEO would embarrass the family name and create what he called inappropriate optics for the company's image among longtime investors." I sat with that for a long moment. It wasn't about my performance. It wasn't about the numbers I had delivered in logistics or the department turnaround that had become something of a case study internally. It was about where I had started and his discomfort with the world knowing it. "What do you think I should do?" I asked. Walter's answer surprised me. "Nothing different than what you have done for the past 3 years, Miss Torres. Your work has spoken clearly enough that 7 of the 9 board members have already indicated their support. Nathaniel's opposition is loud, but it is not, at this moment, decisive. Then why tell me at all? Because I have learned, over 40 years in this business, that the people who succeed longest are never blindsided by the challenges in front of them. I would rather you walk into that boardroom in 2 weeks knowing exactly what you're facing than discover it in the room itself." I thanked him, though my mind was already racing through the 2 weeks ahead, wondering how I would face a man who had never spoken a single word to me in 2 years, yet somehow still held enough power to end everything I had worked for. The 2 weeks that followed were a blur of preparation. I reviewed every quarterly report the company had published in the last 5 years. I met individually with each board member who had expressed support, not to campaign, but simply to answer their questions, honestly, the same way I had approached every rotation throughout the program. I did not reach out to Nathaniel. Some part of me wanted to force a conversation, wanted him to look me in the eye and explain himself the way Diane never had the chance to. But I decided against it. I had built everything over the past 3 years on merit, not confrontation, and I wasn't going to change that approach now, no matter how justified the confrontation might have felt. 3 days before the board vote, I received an email I didn't expect. It was from Nathaniel Ashworth directly, requesting a private meeting. I almost declined. Then I remembered something Walter had told me during my first year in the program, during one of the many nights I'd considered quitting. Difficult conversations, handled honestly, rarely go the way you fear they will. I agreed to meet him. He asked to meet not at the office, but at a small cafe near the harbor, somewhere neutral, somewhere neither of us held any particular power over the space. When I arrived, he was already seated at a corner table, and for the first time in 3 years, I saw the face that belonged to the name I had cleaned house for without ever meeting. He looked older than I expected, tired, in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "Miss Torres," he said, standing briefly as I approached. "Thank you for coming." I sat across from him, saying nothing, waiting. "I owe you an apology," he said, before I could speak first. Not the kind of apology I've apparently been giving through board memos. A real one. I stayed quiet, letting him continue. "When Diane told me the ring was missing and that you were responsible, I didn't ask a single question. I signed off on your termination from an airport lounge between meetings without ever once considering that the woman who had kept my home running smoothly for 2 years might deserve 5 minutes of my attention before I ended her livelihood. His hands were folded tightly on the table. I've spent the last 3 years telling myself that opposing your promotion was about protecting the company's image. But the truth is simpler and far less flattering. Every time your name comes up in a board meeting, I am forced to remember exactly how easily I discarded someone who never did anything wrong. And it is easier to be angry at you for reminding me of that than it is to sit with what I actually did. I felt something shift in my chest, not quite forgiveness, not yet, but something adjacent to it. You could have asked me anything over these past 3 years, I said quietly. You could have looked at my file, at my work, the way your grandfather did from the very beginning. Instead, you wrote memos from a distance. I know, he said, and I have no excuse for that except my own pride, which I am only now beginning to understand was never actually protecting anything worth protecting. He slid an envelope across the table. This is my formal statement to the board, withdrawing my opposition and offering my full support for your appointment. I wanted you to see it before I submit it tomorrow morning, because you deserve to know it's not a political calculation. It's an apology in the only language I know how to speak fluently enough to mean it. I opened the envelope slowly, reading through lines that acknowledged, in writing, exactly what he had just told me in person. My hands were steady in a way I hadn't expected them to be. Thank you, I said finally, not for the apology alone, for finally asking the questions you should have asked 3 years ago. We sat in silence for a moment, the harbor wind pulling gently at the edges of the papers between us. The vote is the day after tomorrow, Nathaniel said eventually. I won't pretend my support changes everything that happened, but I hope it's a start. 2 days later, I stood outside the same boardroom doors I had walked past 100 times during my rotations, waiting to hear whether 3 years of exhausted nights, failed exams retaken, and quiet doubt would finally lead somewhere I had once believed impossible for someone like me. The doors opened, and Margaret Chen, the same attorney whose phone call had started this entire journey 3 years earlier, stepped out with an expression I couldn't quite read. Miss Torres, she said, the board would like you to come in. I followed Margaret Chen through the heavy wooden doors, my heels echoing against the marble floor of the boardroom, the same room I had passed 100 times during my rotations but had never once entered. 9 board members sat around a long oval table. Walter was there, seated at the head, thinner than I remembered him even from our last meeting, but his eyes were sharp and steady as they met mine. Nathaniel sat near the far end, his expression unreadable, though he gave me the smallest nod as I walked in. Miss Torres, said the board chairwoman, a woman named Patricia Voss, who I had met only briefly during my final rotation. Please, sit. I sat at the empty chair, positioned at the opposite end of the table from Walter, facing the entire board. My hands were folded in my lap, steady despite the pounding in my chest. We have reviewed your performance across every department of this company over the past 3 years. Patricia began. Your work in logistics restructuring alone saved this company an estimated $11 million annually. Your leadership evaluations from every rotation, without exception, describe you as someone who elevates the people around you rather than simply managing them. She paused, glancing briefly at the papers in front of her. We have also reviewed the circumstances of your departure from this family's employment 3 years ago, and the subsequent legal resolution regarding Diane Whitfield. My throat tightened at the mention of that name, but I kept my composure, waiting. The board voted this morning, prior to your arrival, Patricia continued. I want you to understand that this decision was not made lightly, and it was not made unanimously easy, even among those who ultimately voted in your favor. I braced myself, unsure which direction her words were heading. By a vote of 8-1, this board has approved your appointment as Chief Executive Officer of Ashworth Holdings, effective immediately. For a moment, I couldn't process the words. I had prepared myself over the past 2 days for disappointment. I had rehearsed quietly in my apartment what I would say to Sophia if the answer had been no, how I would explain that sometimes hard work isn't enough to overcome where you started from. I hadn't prepared anything for yes. 8-1, I repeated softly, my voice barely steady. Patricia's expression softened slightly. Mr. Ashworth's grandson abstained rather than voting against you, which, given his earlier written opposition, the board considers a meaningful gesture in itself. I looked down the table at Nathaniel, who met my eyes this time without looking away. He didn't smile, exactly, but something in his expression had shifted from the tired guilt I'd seen at the Harbor Cafe into something closer to quiet respect. Walter rose slowly from his seat at the head of the table, and the room fell silent as he made his way toward me. He extended his hand, and I stood to meet it. 3 years ago, he said, loud enough for the entire room to hear, I told you that failure was never the true risk. Quitting was the only failure that mattered. You never quit, Miss Torres. Not once, in 3 years, even when every reasonable person would have understood if you had. I shook his hand, my eyes stinging with tears I refused to let fall in front of the board. Thank you, I said, for seeing something in me nobody else bothered to look for. I saw what was always there, Walter said quietly, just between the two of us. I simply gave it room to be recognized. The formal announcement to the company went out that same afternoon, and by the time I left the building that evening, my phone had already begun buzzing with messages from colleagues throughout every department I had rotated through over the past 3 years. Logistics workers who remembered me organizing their shift schedules more fairly than any manager before me. Junior accountants who remembered late nights I'd stayed to help them understand a report before an early morning deadline. I drove home in silence, letting the weight of the day settle slowly over me, and when I walked through my front door, Sophia, now 9 years old, having grown up almost entirely during the years of this journey, ran to meet me the way she always did. Mommy, how was your meeting? I knelt down to her level, still in my work clothes, still holding the weight of everything that had just happened. Sophia, I said, do you remember how I told you that sometimes people say things about us that aren't true, and it feels like the whole world believes them? She nodded solemnly, the way children do when they sense something important is being said. And do you remember how I told you that the truth always finds its way out, even when it takes a really long time? She nodded again. Well, I said, my voice finally breaking with the emotion I had held back all day. The truth found its way out today. And because of it, Mommy has a new job. A very big job? Bigger than cleaning houses? She asked, with the innocent bluntness only a child could offer. I laughed, pulling her into a tight hug. Much bigger, baby. But you know what? Cleaning houses is where I learned everything I needed to know to be good at this new job. Never let anyone tell you that where you start doesn't matter, just as much as where you end up. That night, after Sophia had fallen asleep, I sat alone on my small apartment balcony, looking out at the city skyline where, somewhere among those lit windows, sat the top floor office that would now be mine. I thought about Diane Whitfield, whose greed had taken everything from me for a brief, devastating period, and whose actions had inadvertently placed me in front of the one person willing to look past a false accusation and see something worth investing in. I thought about Nathaniel, who had needed 3 years and a quiet harbor conversation to finally ask the questions he should have asked from the very beginning, and who had, in the end, found the courage to make that right in the only way that truly mattered. Not through empty words, but through an honest reckoning with his own failure. And I thought about the woman I had been 3 years earlier, standing outside those iron gates with a small bag of belongings and a photo of my daughter tucked into my jacket pocket, certain that 2 years of honest work had disappeared into nothing. That woman hadn't disappeared into nothing. She had simply been waiting for someone to finally look closely enough to see what had been there all along. The following Monday, I walked back through the same glass doors of Ashworth Holdings, past the same receptionist who had once barely glanced at me, and into an elevator that carried me all the way to the top floor. The office that had once belonged to Walter Ashworth now had a new name etched into the glass beside the door: Elena Torres, Chief Executive Officer. I stood there for a long moment before walking inside, remembering every scrubbed floor, every failed exam retaken, every night I had nearly given up, and understanding, finally, that none of it had been wasted. It had all been preparation for exactly this moment. 6 months into my role as CEO, I made a decision that surprised almost everyone on the board except Walter, who told me privately that he had been quietly hoping I would arrive at it on my own. I created a new department within Ashworth Holdings, one that had never existed before. We called it the Foundations Program, and its entire purpose was simple: identify employees in entry-level positions across every branch of the company: warehouse workers, cleaning staff, delivery drivers, administrative assistants, who showed the same quiet excellence I had once shown without anyone noticing, and give them the same opportunity Walter had once given me. No employee would ever again have their potential overlooked simply because of the uniform they wore to work. The first group of 12 candidates entered the program that spring. I made sure to personally interview each one, not because I doubted the selection process, but because I remembered exactly how it had felt to sit across from someone in power who was willing to actually listen. One of those 12 candidates was a young man named Marcus, who had spent 4 years working in our warehouse facility, and who reminded me so much of myself at that stage that I nearly had to leave the room to compose myself during our first meeting. As for Diane Whitfield, her case concluded with a lengthy prison sentence and a mountain of restitution she would spend the rest of her life repaying. I never sought her out, never asked to see her, never needed the kind of closure some people imagine is necessary after being wronged. The truth had already spoken for itself, and that was closure enough. Nathaniel and I built something unexpected over the following months. Not quite friendship, not quite family, but a working relationship built on an honesty neither of us had offered the other during those first 2 silent years. He became one of the program's strongest advocates on the board, often the first to push for expanding it further than I had originally proposed. Walter passed away peacefully 8 months after I became CEO, surrounded by family in the same manner I had once cleaned as a young woman with nothing but exhaustion and hope keeping her going. I was asked to speak at his memorial, and I stood in front of hundreds of people who had known him far longer than I had, and told them the only story I truly knew how to tell. I told them about a phone call from a stranger, an old man who watched security footage until he found the truth, and a folder placed gently on a desk that changed the entire direction of my life. I told them that Walter Ashworth didn't build an empire by looking only at people who already had everything. He built it by looking closely enough to find the people who had nothing except the willingness to work harder than anyone expected of them. Sophia is 12 years old now. She still remembers, in fragments, the years when I came home exhausted from night classes, when dinner was sometimes cereal, because there wasn't time for anything else, when she fell asleep, some nights waiting for me to come home from a rotation that ran late. She tells people now, with the kind of pride only a child can carry so openly, that her mother used to clean houses and now runs one of the biggest companies in the state. I always correct her gently when she says it that way. I tell her I didn't go from cleaning houses to running a company. I tell her that cleaning houses taught me everything I needed to know to run one. Patience, attention to the smallest details, respect for work that most people walk past without noticing, and the quiet understanding that dignity was never something anyone else had the power to take from me, no matter how hard they tried. 3 years ago, I stood outside a set of iron gates with a bag of belongings and a photo of my daughter, believing that my entire life's worth of honest work had disappeared in 20 minutes, because someone needed a name to blame. I know now that nothing about that moment was the end of my story. It was simply the door I needed to walk through to find the one that was actually meant for me. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or blamed for something you didn't do, I want you to know that the truth has a way of finding its path forward, even when it takes longer than you think you can bear. Please take a moment to like this video if this story stayed with you the way it stayed with me while writing it. Subscribe to this channel if you want to hear more real stories about people who refused to let a false start define the rest of their lives. Share this with anyone who needs a reminder today that where you begin is never where you have to end up. And I would love to read your thoughts in the comments below. Has there ever been a moment in your life when the truth finally caught up, even after everything felt lost? Thank you for staying until the very end of this story. It means more than you know.